Her eyes were missing, her tongue was missing, parts of her lip was missing, and a portion of her skull had fractured and a piece of her skull had been removed. Hey, what's going on, guys? Mr. Ballin here from TikTok. I'm your resident scary storyteller. Today, I have a really cool story. It's actually one of the first kind of unsolved mysteries that really captured my attention and drew me into researching all of these kind of crazy unsolved mysteries that are out there. The too long didn't read version of this is you have 9 highly experienced hikers that go off into the mountains and die under extremely mysterious conditions. There are photos and journal entries. I mean, there's just a preponderance of evidence, but no one can make any sense of it. And to this day, it is one of the single most interesting things that I've ever found on the internet. So, in 1959, 10 hikers decided to head out on this 190-mile journey through the Ural Mountains in the northern part of the Soviet Union. Now, this was not a vacation. This was more like a mission to this group of experienced hikers, because in completing this 190-mile journey, they would receive their level 3 hiker certification, which at the time was the highest in the country. So they would be the top dogs in hiking. So on January 25th, they set off on this 16-day, 190-mile journey. The group was in good spirits. The pictures of them, they were happy. They were on course. Everything was going right. And then they reached this kind of critical juncture in the trip. They reached this mountain pass that actually was subsequently renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of the group. The leader was named Igor Dyatlov. And so they reach this mountain pass and they know they need to go through it. They need to negotiate this mountain pass. And so they set up camp, and the plan is early the next day, they're going to attempt to push through this mountain pass. And hopefully over the space of one day, they would be able to get through that mountain pass and set up camp on the other side. So early the next morning, they get up and they begin their ascent through this mountain pass. But unfortunately, a very bad weather system rolled in and it pushed them off course. And in fact, it pushed them onto a different slope that the local Mansi tribe called Dead Mountain. And so they get pushed off course. They're not going to get through the mountain pass. And then one of the first strange things happens. For some reason, now this group of experienced hikers that should have known that their best bet at this point, because of the bad weather and being pushed off course, would be to retreat off the mountain and find somewhere that was more protected to spend the night, because at this point they got to set up camp somewhere. But for some reason they decide to stay on the exposed slope of Dead Mountain, which means that they would be setting up camp in not only just a wickedly windy area, and there's like risk of avalanche and any number of things could happen, but they'd also be exposed to negative 40-degree temperatures. They're like out in the open, just getting crushed by the elements. But for whatever reason, they make camp right on the slopes of Dead Mountain. So when the hikers don't show up to a rendezvous point that they were supposed to meet at a predetermined time, the folks they were set to meet, who obviously didn't meet up with the hikers, they let authorities know. It was noted that they had not made rendezvous, but because this was an experienced group, this was not a, now let's send out the search party. It was more like, okay, they should have been here, but it's 9 people, they know what they're doing, they'll get here soon. 3 weeks go by, and still no one's heard from these 9 hikers. And at this point, a search party is sent out, even including military units are sent out to find them. And relatively quickly, the search party comes across the campsite on Dead Mountain, and what they find is just horrifying. So the first thing they notice is that the tent they had been staying in had been slashed open, except from the inside, meaning someone inside the tent had slashed it open. And then in the tent itself, neatly stacked, was all their cold weather gear, or the majority of their cold weather gear, like their shoes and their jackets. I mean, it's all there. And there's no sign of the hikers. And then near the camp, like literally right out of this tent, is this neat set of footprints leading down towards this forest. And investigators, when they looked at the footprints, they could determine a couple of things. One, the majority of the hikers had either been barefoot or only wearing one shoe. In addition, their cadence, they were looking at the space of their footsteps, their gait, I should say, was indicative of a group of people that was walking calmly. This was not a panicked run away from your campsite. This was a walking calmly away from your campsite with not the right clothing on, probably no shoes on, down to the forest in an exposed mountain slope with negative 40-degree temperatures. So investigators, they start following these footsteps down towards this forest, and it leads them to this area right at the outside of this forest, right underneath this big cedar tree, where there's evidence of a campfire. And around that campfire are two of the hikers' bodies. And they're just wearing underwear, they're barefoot, and their hands had been like scraped. The palms of their hands had been badly scraped. And the tree that was right next to them had evidence of someone had been trying to climb it. A lot of the branches had been ripped down, as if someone had desperately tried to climb up this tree, but was unsuccessful. As if they were trying to, seek shelter from something or someone on the ground. But obviously they did not make it in time. Within several hundred feet of that campfire, the investigators found 3 other hikers' bodies. They were similarly underdressed. And it appeared, the way their bodies had frozen, that they were actually trying to make their way back up to the campsite. Investigators noted that one of those 3 hikers had a head injury that was consistent with someone repeatedly smashing their head. Another of those 3 had a strange rectangular bruise on their side. And then, oddly enough, while they were underdressed, each of those 3 were wearing the other's bits of clothing. It was like they all collectively put on the wrong clothes and not enough clothes. Despite the strangeness of the 5 bodies that were found and what they were wearing, or I guess what they weren't wearing, it was determined that they all died of hypothermia and that there was no foul play. It wasn't until May, when the weather warmed up a little bit and some of the snow had melted, that investigators were able to locate the remaining 4 hikers' bodies. And, it was really the condition that they were found in, the second group of hikers, that really took this mystery and elevated it and made it this kind of urban legend, because it makes no sense how they were found. So the remaining 4 were found in this creek bed that came to be known as the Dyatlov Den. They were buried under about 13 feet of snow. And so of the 4 bodies that were found in the Dyatlov Den, one of them had simply died of hypothermia and kind of was a lot like the first group, right? There's no severe injuries, really, just they died of hypothermia. But the other 3, that was not the case at all. The 7th hiker had a skull fracture that occurred right before he died. The 8th hiker had these extreme chest fractures that it was almost like he'd been hit by a car. The 9th hiker really was the most unfortunate. Not only did she also have her chest kind of caved in, but her eyes were missing, her tongue was missing, parts of her lip was missing, and a portion of her skull had fractured and a piece of her skull had been removed. Even more bizarre is, in this second group, they had all taken pieces of clothing from the other, indicating that they had all died at different times. It was like one would die and then the other hikers would take their clothes and put them on. And then someone else would die and they would take their clothes and put them on. And I guess even stranger than that is the clothes themselves had traces of radiation on them. The Soviet government was quick to close the case. They cited, either a natural disaster or, perhaps the hikers' incompetence as the result or the reason behind this horrible tragedy. But, nobody really believed, nobody as in the family, the friends, really the Soviet population, they didn't believe that could be the actual explanation. Early on, after this case has been closed, the Soviet people, they started to believe a couple theories. One of them was there was this local Mansi tribe that was in the area that perhaps ambushed the hikers and killed them. That would kind of explain the the reason for the hikers suddenly abandoning their tent and not being dressed, and also the injuries of the second group, that could be explained by, an attack by this Mansi tribe. But there was a couple issues with that theory. One, the Mansi tribe is known as this incredibly peaceful tribe, that it's just very uncharacteristic for them. There was also no other footprints leading into the area. It was just the footprints of the hikers that were, in the area. Another popular theory is a swift and violent avalanche that, the group couldn't have seen coming. They hear it at the last minute. They jump out of their tent, cut it open, they go running. But the problem with that is the tree line down near the forest they walked to, there's no sign that the trees have been damaged in any way, that, there weren't any debris from an avalanche like there would be. And in that area, there were locals like the Mansi tribe, and they didn't report an avalanche, they didn't hear an avalanche. And in fact, historically, there had never been a reported avalanche in that area. And subsequently, for decades afterward, there still has never been an avalanche there. Another popular theory is that the reason they left their tent in the first place is because when you get hypothermia, it can cause you to actually believe, kind of paradoxically, that you're actually too hot and you start stripping your clothes before you ultimately succumb to hypothermia. But again, that doesn't really cover down on the injuries of the second group. And then, of course, with any sort of unsolved mystery at this magnitude, there's theories that range from, a government cover-up to like a Yeti attack or an alien abduction. This case was closed, and the Soviet government kind of just gave a fairly ambiguous answer as to why. Authorities actually officially said that the cause of death for these hikers was a compelling natural force that they were not able to overcome, which that in and of itself is an eerie way of putting it, right? They were unable to overcome a natural force. And it's not saying this was a natural disaster necessarily. They're just saying it was a natural force, which is just a very interesting way to put it. But either way, the case was closed, and that was that. But in 2019, Russia actually officially reopened this case. And they decided they were going to get to the bottom of it, because this was a case that, it is quite high profile in the world of kind of unsolved mysteries. I think if you Google top 10 unsolved mysteries, the Dyatlov Pass is going to come up in that top 10. This is just one of the more well-known cases. And so Russia officially reopens it in 2019, but they were only willing to look at 3 theories, which was an ice slab or a snow slab breaking and coming down and hitting them, an avalanche, or a hurricane. But unfortunately, despite diving into this and doing their diligence, they really didn't come to any sort of conclusive conclusion. They kind of ended it, they closed it, I should say, much the same way they did back when it actually happened in the late 50s, which is, yep, some natural force did this. They did, that was it. It was really unsatisfying. The only real conclusion that they made in 2019 was that no criminal activity was indicated. So whatever happened, they're saying was natural. It was not, it was not criminal. So with that, the mystery today remains technically closed, but unofficially, I would say this mystery is not even close to solved. And I'd love to hear in the comments what you think happened at Dyatlov Pass. So that's going to do it, guys. I encourage you to go check this out, Dyatlov Pass. It's fascinating. And please, if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel. And also, please turn on notifications so you don't miss any of these stories. I'm going to be putting these out weekly. It'll range from mysteries to scary stuff to disturbing, creepy stuff. Kind of just generally interesting, darker content is going to be the focus of this channel. Also, be sure to check me out on TikTok. My handle is Mr. Ballin, same as my YouTube channel. I'm also on Instagram, but my handle is JohnBallin416. That's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week. It turned out that he had physically torn his vocal cords from screaming incessantly. In the height of World War II, Russian scientists wanted to find a way to keep their soldiers awake longer. And so they devised this experiment, this human experiment, to test the effects of extreme sleep deprivation. And so what they did is they rounded up 5 prisoners of war and offered them their freedom if they went through this experiment, which I can tell you went sideways. And so the way it worked is they were going to be put inside of this sealed gas chamber that continuously was going to administer this stimulant gas. It was an experimental stimulant gas. This is not something they knew much about, but they were fairly confident that it wouldn't kill them and that it would keep them awake. And so they put them inside the chamber and they started administering the gas. This was not at a time where they had closed circuit cameras. Those weren't around at the time. All they had was, they could put microphones in there, and they had these 5-inch thick little porthole windows. They had one porthole window where the researchers could look into the chamber itself. So the experiment begins, and really for the first 3-4 days, everything was pretty normal. At about the day 4 mark, the researchers started to notice a change in what they were discussing, the subjects. It went from kind of small talk over those first few days to fairly dark. They started talking almost exclusively about traumatic events that had happened to them in their life. And around the day 4 mark is when the subjects started complaining about being in this test at all. The first few days was filled with some optimism that this was their ticket out of the terrible situation they were in. And then it really turned into, this is a terrible situation. I think it was around the day 6 mark, the subjects stopped talking to each other completely. They became paranoid of the other subjects, and they went to their own sections of the chamber. And in the chamber, they had places to sit. There was food, there was water, there was a bathroom. There was books in there to read. They kind of took up space inside of the chamber. They began to believe that they could kind of like sell out their comrades in exchange for getting out of this experiment. So they would, one by one come up to the porthole or go over to one of the microphones that was obviously placed inside the chamber and start whispering these kind of imagined defenses of the other subjects to try to get them in trouble in exchange for being released from this experiment, which, that didn't do anything. The researchers, they didn't care what they said. They just listened and watched. After 9 days, the experiment took a significant turn for the worst. It was the morning of I think it was the 10th day, where the screaming began. One of the test subjects began screaming. And at this point, everybody is totally segregated. They're not talking to each other. They're muttering and whispering. And one of them just starts screaming. And so for 3 hours, they watch him scream at the top of his lungs and run back and forth across this little chamber until he stopped screaming, but he's still running. And they could kind of pick up on the microphone that he was still making sound, but it was like these little squeaks. It turned out that he had physically torn his vocal cords from screaming incessantly. The other subjects didn't react to the screaming at all. It was like it wasn't happening, but they're in this confined space, right? It's so loud in there. And all that happened is, as he's screaming, the other subjects began ripping out pages of the book, soaking them, and then pushing them up against the porthole glass, obscuring the view. So by the time the subject who had torn his vocal cords stopped, by the time he tore his vocal cords and it went quiet, the researchers couldn't actually see into the chamber anymore. And once the guy had torn his vocal cords, there was no more sound in the room. So their view is obscured, and now it's gone silent. After 3 days of talking about what they're going to do, of complete silence in the room. They can't see in, it's silent. They're monitoring the oxygen levels in the room, and based on oxygen consumption in the room, apparently they could tell that there were people in there, probably at least 4 or 5, that were breathing oxygen because it was being consumed. So they believed they were alive, but after 3 days of silence, which really didn't make any sense, they determined that, either our microphones are broken, and that's a problem, or there's something wrong with the subjects themselves. So they decide that they're going to use the intercom to reach out to the subjects and basically tell them that they're going to come into the room. Hey, we're going to test the microphones. We're going to be coming into the chamber. You need to lay on the ground and not interact with us. If you comply, we will offer one of you immediate release and freedom. So there's silence. After they use the intercom, they decide to do that. They talk to the intercom, and one of the subjects, now to this point again, for 3 days it's been silent. And one of the subjects, clear as can be, talks into the microphone and just says, "We no longer want to be freed." And so the researchers were like, okay, I guess they're alive and our microphones work, so they don't go in. They stay out of the chamber. Silence continues all the way up until the 15th day because, the window's still obscured. The subjects are not speaking, they're not muttering, they're not whispering, it's just silence. And on the 15th day, at midnight on the 15th day, they decide that the experiment was over. And so what they did is they flushed the room of the stimulant that had been continuously pouring into the room. They turned that off and they replaced it with fresh air. And that's when they started hearing the screaming from the subjects inside of the chamber. They were begging them, the researchers, to turn the gas back on, pleading with them, like begging, please turn it back on, as if they were dying. And then they opened the chamber, and now they're laying eyes on the chamber for the first time since like the 10th day. So it's been like 5 days. And they're seeing the chamber with their own eyes for the first time, and it's straight out of a horror scene. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive. The 5th subject, who had perished at some point, there was chunks of flesh that had been taken off of his chest and his leg and had been jammed into the drain in the center of the room. And they had turned on the water in the bathroom and had flooded the room. There was almost 4 inches of water on the ground, like murky, stagnant, lots of gross stuff in their water all over the ground. And there's this dead subject. And all 4 of them have also, there's chunks of their own flesh that's been ripped off of their body. And it was later determined that it was self-inflicted, these chunks of meat that had been pulled off of them. And it was not by teeth either, it was by hand. And also they were eating it. So they were ripping off pieces of their body and eating it. The food storage that was down there hadn't been touched in days. It was like they had all completely lost their mind and began eating themselves. These subjects did not want to leave the chamber. They just continued to beg for the gas to be turned back on. And so finally they brought in some soldiers to actually extract the living subjects out of the chamber, but they fought so aggressively to stay there. And in fact, one of the subjects jumped up and bit the neck of one of the soldiers, and he actually bled to death. Also, one of the subjects in the struggle, his spleen ruptured and he bled to death. So now you have 2 casualties just getting them out of the room. They finally get the 3 remaining subjects, living subjects, out of the room, and they heavily restrain them. They bring them to a medical facility because they need to go under surgery because they've had chunks of their own flesh ripped off. They're totally emaciated. And the most injured of the 3 is immediately brought into surgery, while the other 2 were just kind of held in a holding room. And they try to give him a sedative in order to prepare him for surgery. This is not the anesthetic, this is just the sedative. And it's like he's immune to it. They give him a sedative, it does nothing. And he's just like resisting them, and he keeps begging to go back under the gas. And then finally they say, okay, well, we're just going to give him the anesthetic now. And when they bring it out and they tell him, we're going to give you an anesthetic and we're going to give you the surgery, he starts viciously fighting back. He does not want the anesthetic. He's pleading for them not to give him the anesthetic, that he must remain awake. He needs to remain awake, put me back under the gas. And in his struggle to not have the anesthetic given to him, he manages to tear one of the leather straps that was holding him down. So like an extreme amount of force. And then finally, when they give him the anesthetic, and they had to give him like 10 times the dosage or whatever just to get him to calm down, as soon as he fell asleep, he died. So after he passes away, they move on to the next worst off subject, the guy who had torn his vocal cords and couldn't speak. They bring him in for surgery, and he can't speak, but he's shaking his head because he doesn't want the anesthetic, he doesn't want to go under surgery, and he's fighting with them, and he actually just passes out from exhaustion. And he too, once he falls asleep, or I guess falls unconscious, he dies as well. So now there's only 1 subject left. The other 2 that had lived to be pulled out of the chamber have now died as soon as they fell asleep, and the scientists don't have any idea why. Instead of bringing the last survivor into surgery, because now they've witnessed
2 surgeries end in death, they decide, let's put this guy back in the chamber and turn the gas back on, because apparently that's the one thing that's keeping these guys alive. And so in preparation for being put back into the chamber, they hooked him up with an EEG that basically measures your brain waves, which I guess they hadn't done to this point in the experiment. And so they put him in there, and the scientists are watching the readout of the EEG, and they noticed that like his lines would just, inexplicably flatline and then go back to up and down and then flatline again. And one of them had the wherewithal to look at the subject as it's flatlining, and they could see that every time he closed his eyes, it was like he was micro sleeping, like these little blinks. Basically, every time he fell asleep for like a fraction of a second, it was like he was suffering a brain death over and over and over again. And as they're monitoring this, and they know what just happened to the other two, they died when they fell asleep. They're trying to rush to get the gas turned back on to keep this guy alive, but they didn't do it in time, and he eventually succumbs and falls asleep. And they can see before he ultimately dies that initially when he finally fell asleep, the EEG showed that he had fallen into a deep sleep. And then he flatlined and his heart stopped and he died. All of the subjects died, and no one really knows what killed them. Was it the sleep deprivation? Was it the gas? It could be a mixture of the two, but we'll never know. But either way, all of them died. Now, this is actually just a story, and there's no evidence to suggest that it's even true. But during that time frame in the 40s, during World War II, there were known cases of horrific, unethical human experimentation happening, like in the Japanese, that awful Unit 731. I would not suggest Googling that unless you got a really strong stomach. You had in the concentration camps, the German concentration camps, human experimentation was definitely happening. And obviously Germany and Japan are not Russia, but it was just in this era where human experimentation was definitely happening. So even if this particular story, the Russian sleep experiment, is not true, I wouldn't be shocked in the least if there wasn't a similar study done somewhere. Obviously, the results could vary dramatically, but I do think that it's certainly possible that something like this could have happened. We continue to study sleep and sleep deprivation, and really there's not much known about it. We don't even really know why we sleep. But we do know that you will die if you go without sleep. I think the longest any human went without sleep was like 18 days. And I can actually speak from my own experience. I was a Navy SEAL for 7 years, and we go through something called Hell Week in initial training, where over a period of 5.5 days, you sleep for a total of 4 hours. Not every night 4 hours, but a grand total of 4 hours. And it's split up into 2 little chunks, 2 hours and 2 hours. And then there's like a 15-minute and 15-minute nap thrown in there too. And you really just lose your mind after 72 hours. I remember I was constantly hallucinating that when I was around my classmates, their head would turn into a big Rubik's Cube and start flipping around. And even when I got right next to them, their head would still be flopping around like a Rubik's Cube. And that's only 72 hours in. I can only imagine what would happen at 15 days. So that's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed my version of the Russian sleep experiment. Go check it out on Creepypasta or just Google Russian sleep experiment. There's loads of stuff on the internet about it. If you're not already, do check me out on TikTok. So my handle on TikTok is the same as my YouTube handle. It's Mr. Ballen. I post videos in there daily. Lots of horror stuff, scary stuff. If you're into that, go check it out. Also, I have an Instagram, John B. Allen 416 is my handle there. More Navy SEAL content on there, but if you're interested in that, go check it out. And that's going to do it. So please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Let me know if you want to hear other stories that you think I do a good job telling. Let me know, and I'll see if I can do it. And that's going to do it. Thanks, guys.